Good morning, good afternoon, whatever. Welcome to the Wilson Center and to today's book launch. I'm Hale Esfandiari, and I'm a fellow at the Wilson Center. We are delighted that the Middle East program organized today's meeting. And we are very fortunate to have with us Rita Stephan, the editor of COVID and Gender in the Middle East, and also on our panel in person and on via Zoom, a number of the contributors to this book. Val Muqaddam is, I just briefly saw her before the meeting. She will be on Zoom. Special welcome to you, Val. She is not only a very good friend, but was a fellow at the Wilson Center over, I believe, a decade ago. Rita, I must confess, I was struck and amused by the first sentence in your introduction to the book. You open with a quote, and I'm quoting you. France says COVID-19 is definitely female. You ask why this is newsworthy. It is newsworthy, I think, as the book shows, because even disease can be gendered. Mm-hmm. I immediately thought to myself that it was not enough that women are blamed for everything horrible that occurs in the world. They now are told, in France at least, and other probably French-speaking countries, that COVID is female. I immediately thought about usage in my native language, Persian, and was grateful to see that in Persian, COVID is neither male nor female, but neutral in gender. I believe Val will agree with me. Persian at least leaves the gender of the disease to the imagination. Seriously, Rita, you have done a magnificent job in this book. COVID and Gender in the Middle East, I think, is a groundbreaking book. It reads so well, and people will be turning to it for a long time as a reference because of the originality and solidity of its subject. Since the COVID pandemic and its spread around the world, there have been articles, we know, and books on the impact of COVID on women in various countries, including the MENA region. But I believe this book stands out because it takes a comprehensive look and from different perspectives at what COVID contagion has meant to women in the MENA region. The COVID pandemic, I think, occurred at a moment when a positive change was taking place in the role and status of women when in a number of the MENA countries. But COVID meant many, many steps back. And the book shows us the many ways in which the impact of COVID in the MENA region had to it a gender dimension as well. And I'm going to give you some quotes from the essay of this wonderful book to illustrate what there is here to read. Lina Abirafe writes, we know from global evidence that the virus and its aftermath affect women and girls more severely. According to Melinda Gates, while we are all in this storm together, some are holding on the raft, some sheltering in a large boat, and some safe on shore. Val, referring to a UN report of 2020, adds, the presence of unequal gender relations and the persistence of male bias and patriarchal norms would result in a greater toll on women. Rizlen Benashir and Sophia Rais, writing in their essay of violence against women in Morocco, point out physical, sexual, psychological, and economic violence against women increased during the pandemic. They continue, despite the increased physical abuse, women could not leave their husbands because they did not have proper travel authorization or a place to go. And these points never would occur to an average person in different societies. The common theme that runs across the essay in the book is that in the MENA region, women in general have suffered more than men. COVID resulted in economic, social, and personal setbacks for women, in addition to an uptick in domestic violence. The book also shows that feminist groups have been very active to help women to cope with the negative consequences of COVID, but there is so much they could do. The book covers several countries, among them Lebanon, Jordan, Morocco, Bahrain, Tunisia, and as you can guess, the less affluent the society, the more women were at a disadvantage. Women in general lost more jobs than men. They were victimized in both the private and the public sector. A number of the regional countries took the view that because men were the breadwinners in the family, in time of crisis, working women have to make way for men. COVID and gender in the Middle East is in 4 interrelated parts, and I'm going to give away the book. It also covers marginalized groups and communities such as Syrian women emigres in Jordan, the LGBTIQ community in Lebanon, and Palestinian women confronting the problem of COVID. Throughout the essays in the book, we also learn how men have reacted to COVID, both in the family and in the society. Let me mention to our audience the 4 main parts of which the book is organized. And by the way, they will be selling the books after the panel. Part 1, care and care work spheres. Part 2, social vulnerability. Part 3, a gender lens on COVID impact in the Middle East and North Africa. And Part 4, a feminist response, which is very important. Let me conclude by saying once again how pleased we are to be able to host the launch of such an important book at the Wilson Center. Thank you, Marissa, and thanks to the Middle East program team for enabling us to host this distinguished panel at the center. I would now call on you, Marissa, my friend and colleague. She's a wonderful director of the Middle East program who is doing miracles for us. And she is a contributor to the book to moderate the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hale. Thank you. Thank you, Hale, for your very warm introduction and your amazing pitch for the book. I'm also very delighted to be moderating this discussion with the maestro, the organizer and the editor of COVID and Gender in MENA, Rita Stephan, who's currently visiting researcher at the Khairallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies at North Carolina State University. And to your left is Lina Abi Rafeh, executive director or former executive director of the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University and author of many books. One of them is this one right here, Gender and International Aid in Afghanistan, which I think is very timely book given all the challenges that women and girls are facing in Afghanistan. Valentine Muqaddam, who's with us from Boston, a former Wilson Fellow, as Hala mentioned, and Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Northeastern University, and Munira May Sharad, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas, Austin, who's with us online. We may have lost her. We'll get back to her in a few seconds. I think we're working on it. And last but not least, Maro Youssef, who is the National Science Foundation Postdoctoral Research Fellow at USC in California. So welcome to all of you. And before I kick off the discussion with you, Rita, just a reminder to all of our online audience to submit their questions in the comments section or to tweet to @WilsonCenterMEP. So Rita, your introductory chapter, as Hale mentioned, is basically tackles the question of why is COVID female? So can you sort of unpack this for us a little bit? Walk us through why you brought around 30 authors, both women and men, together to address the gender aspects of COVID in the MENA region.
Well, first, thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Halle. Thank you, Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you to all the contributors, the reviewers of the book. This was a compulsive project. I felt I had to do it. Mm-hmm. Let me say that all views expressed here are mine and do not reflect the opinion of the U.S. government or the State Department, which is my employer as well. When COVID hit, immediately we realized that the world was not ready. Mm-hmm. But more specifically, Middle East and North Africa lacked the medical infrastructure to address the pandemic. And it became a question of who lives and who dies, who gets access to help, and who is not worthy of saving. Mm-hmm. There were many things that everybody was rushing to do, and I kept hearing second-order impact, and that was economic impact from the lockdown. Yet I would hear from my friends in the field saying, women's rights, domestic violence, what became the shadow pandemic of the domestic violence throughout the world. And women that I was working with, women's organizations said, but we're doing this. We pivoted to do that. I felt I had to bring the voices together. Still today, when you look online, Middle Eastern women have nothing to offer the world in terms of their shared experiences or anything worthy of learning. And fortunately, this is the reality in the knowledge that is set up right now. However, women in the Middle East and North Africa did a lot. Like in the past, they're very experienced with conflicts and a situation that requires.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yes. They pulled through, and I felt responsible to deliver their voices as they experienced the pandemic, as they experienced the lack of capabilities and uneven capabilities that their countries felt. And this project started from seeing what's already happening out there, chapters from Morocco, from Jordan, from Israel, with the Palestinian women's experience in Israel, all the inequality. So we started having a conversation. I pitched the idea to the University of Texas, and they said, I love it, let's do it. And so a project was born, and I'm so thrilled and honored to have all these wonderful contributors really bring their knowledge, their experience. This is the first and the only thing that you will see in the market on women from the Middle East and their experiences. I hate to say it might be the only thing that will ever be published on the topic. And each chapter, I want to say, has policy recommendations. Mm-hmm. We wrote it in such a way to be evidence-based and have policy recommendations. So next time, God forbid, any issue comes up that the world has to respond to, we are all looking and consulting some of these recommendations that we have here. And I want to leave room for our contributors to tell you about their stories and their chapters.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rita. So Lena, you wrote the foreword for the book, and you talked about your own personal experience, basically working in the humanitarian space and on women's rights from Afghanistan to Mali to Haiti. And as Halle mentioned, quoted you, that basically we see that women and girls suffer more and are victims of violence in all types of challenges, from conflict to pandemic. So if you zoom into the Arab region, how can this trend be reversed? And what are the ingredients to basically ensure that women and girls are not only protected, but also they're also at the helm, they're at the decision-making table, they're in leadership positions, or even part of crisis management committees. I mean, I remember also trying to figure out what governments have had women on their pandemic crisis committees, and there were very few of them, which is very telling. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's hard to talk about solutions in the region unless we really understand what the problems are, which is why this book is so pioneering in so many ways. But the region itself is faced with insurmountable challenges. I mean, it just is one layer after another. The insecurities, protracted crises, economic challenges, political fissures, lack of government representation. It is really difficult to be anyone at all in this region at this present state, but even more so a woman or girl. I keep saying that women and girls are really the secret, the underutilized force, economically, politically, socially. Arab women are underrepresented absolutely everywhere. In politics, a fraction of parliamentary seats. In leadership and decision-making, they're absent. In the economy, women who can work are not accessing work, or they're accessing informal work. All of these things are magnified 100 times by the pandemic. When I was in Lebanon just a few weeks ago, actually, when women talk about all the trouble that they're facing, the backlash against their rights and fundamental freedoms, their inability to raise their voices, human rights abuses, violence, and so on, they said COVID is the least of our problems. And to say something like that is very alarming because, well, where do we go from here? When I look at my focus across humanitarian emergencies over the last several decades has been violence against women. Because if we can't solve that one thing, if we can't find safety in our own bodies and lives and schools and homes and the street and office and public office, that needs to be the starting point before we access all other rights and opportunities that continue to be highly contested. But, COVID really amplified all of those challenges for women and women in the Arab region, and MENA certainly no exception to that. But for me, it's really about looking at what women are already doing. The feminist movements, the local groups, the community groups, women that are on the front lines already, that are working miracles with next to nothing. I look at what's happening around the region with protests and civil disobedience and young people and young women especially that are at the helm of these movements. What are we doing to support them? What are we doing to listen to them? It sounds like it's the simplest solution, but shockingly, over and over again in every single emergency I have been in, across the region, outside of it, and certainly COVID is an emergency, and was just as much as any other, if not more so. We fail to listen to women. I'm going to use one example that is out of the region to illustrate the point because it's shockingly simple. I moved to New York just before the pandemic started, just in time. And we were receiving messages every day from the onset of the pandemic, text messages saying, stay home, stay safe. Well, if anyone knows anything about home being safe, well, that's an assumption that not a lot of women can afford to make. Home should be safe, but it's not. And it took weeks, maybe months, to rectify that error that would have been avoided if we had listened to women from the onset, if we had asked, are we doing the right thing? Are we approaching this in the right way? Is this a solution that resonates with you? We didn't, and we still don't. So something as simple as that took 2 months to undo, and finally we got messages saying, well, if home isn't safe for you, call this hotline and don't worry, and there's help and support, but that's too little too late. And I think that characterizes the response over and over in every place I've seen. But I don't want to end on a despondent note. What I really want to say is that we need to be paying attention to the women who are already doing the work and who have always been doing it. We need to look across all the other sectors, where are the women? They are there and they should be there. Look at the work that we do in politics to advance legislation, to reform discriminatory laws. These are long-term processes. The work that women are doing to access paid work, fair work, to change the balance in terms of unpaid work and labor and the informal economy. All of those things are happening, but we're just not seeing, not supporting, not showcasing, and certainly the donor community, as I've said over and over in all of the countries I've been in, doesn't support these movements in a way that allows them to address the issues, to grow, to scale, and to do the work that we know needs doing. But my hope is in young women. I think that is where that's where the solution lies for me. And if we listen to them, they'll tell us what to do, and we can go from there. That's our best hope.
Yeah, thank you. I like the hopeful message at the end. Much needed.
In a context where hope is hard to come by.
Absolutely.
It's a rare commodity.
Absolutely. So Val, I'm going to turn to you. You wrote about the healthcare system in the region, and basically took us, the readers, to understand how the pandemic unraveled all the different challenges and ills of the healthcare system, but also how it showcased that there are so many gender dimensions to it beyond just women being victims of different of violence and the COVID pandemic itself, of the illness itself. So can you elaborate a little bit more on your chapter and link all of these elements together?
Sure, I'm very happy to do that, and it's a pleasure to see everyone, including a couple of the contributors that I know well but haven't actually seen in a while. My chapter was really an overview of the healthcare systems and their capacity to actually withstand this kind of a pandemic, and then where women were within those healthcare systems and how they were affected by the healthcare systems. So let me just begin by just pointing out a few observations about the nature of the healthcare systems in the region. And of course, they are variable. They vary across the region. But for the most part, they're pretty well developed. And I'm talking about all the Arab countries, Iran and Turkey and Israel. And some are of very good quality, at least for some sections of the population. And most of the healthcare systems do employ native women. And some of them, have migrant women, but I'll get to that in a moment. But there are certain specificities in the region. For example, out-of-pocket expenditures are very high in most countries. And that was something that I looked into and frankly was a little bit surprised about. There's also a quality gap between private and public healthcare systems, in some of the countries. And of course, almost everywhere in the world, rural populations and the poorest populations are the worst served by healthcare. Many citizens in the MENA region do not have health insurance. And a lot of the middle income countries in the region have had 2 decades of deteriorating public health services because of declining investments. And also, of course, we've already heard that the region is characterized by lots of insecurities and conflicts and so on and so forth. Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Libya, very harsh economic sanctions in Iran, also Syria, external debt burden, especially Tunisia, also to some extent Morocco, and the influx of refugees from the internationalized civil conflict in Syria to countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. So those pre-existing shocks certainly taxed the government's capacity to, address and cope with the pandemic. So, those comments that I just made, have gender implications, but let me just make a few gender observations that have more visible gender implications, which of course I discuss in more detail in the chapter. The MENA region is known for extraordinarily high military spending. I spent a lot of time writing about this, and it's a major complaint of mine from a gender perspective as well as from a social spending perspective. Several of the countries in the region spend more on the military than on healthcare. Generally speaking, investments in education are higher in the region, but on healthcare, no. So high military spending reflects the male-dominated and frankly masculinist nature of states and political institutions across the region. And a lot of research for countries around the world, and a couple of papers that I've been involved in too, show that there's a trade-off between high military spending and militarism on the one hand, and social spending and female participation and rights on the other. Speaking of which, female labor force participation in the region is very low. And it's less than half of the global average of 46%. College-educated women tend to have higher rates of employment, but also of unemployment because labor force participation measures most. And what that means is that, large sections of the female populations in most of the larger countries are not part of the labor force. And that really needs a lot of attention. But there are women who work in the health sectors throughout the region. And they are employed as physicians and administrators and nurses and aides and social workers and, at lower levels at cooks and cleaners, etc. Now, during the pandemic, those women, like their male counterparts, were at risk of infection. However, on top of that, and unlike their male counterparts, the women in the health sector also had to carry out health at home. Cooking, cleaning, caring for their children and elderly relatives. And as, feminist scholars found to be the case earlier on with economic crises like structural adjustment and the 2008 economic crisis and so on, the pandemic intensified working women's what is called reproductive labor, and that compelled a lot of them to leave the labor force altogether. By the way, this happened in the United States as well as, in some of the. So a question for me at the time was, would female labor force participation in MENA countries decline even further? Oh, and guess what? In a few countries it has. Then we have this question of, I've already mentioned, and all of us who are in Middle East studies know this very well, that there are variations in income and other kinds of policies and stratification systems across these MENA countries. So then you have the Arab sheikdoms of the Persian Gulf region, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. They have numerous migrant workers and expatriate professionals. And a lot of those expatriate professionals work as physicians, nurses, hospital employees at GCC countries. And there were high rates of infection within that expatriate migrant working population, especially among the numerous male construction workers living in those extremely crowded dormitories. So, that was one of the specific features of the Gulf countries early on. Jordan and Lebanon also have a lot of migrant domestic workers, many of them from South and Southeast Asia. Those domestic workers, by the way, whether they are native in Morocco or a migrant in Gulf countries and in Jordan and Lebanon, they do not fall under labor law provisions. How did they fare? In fact, a lot of them had to leave, the countries. Another specificity of our region, which you don't find in other world regions, is extremely limited intra-regional economic cooperation, in areas like trade and investment and labor flows and collaborative research and development. I mean, it's weak to non-existent. And, a question that I had at the time, and I'm still kind of grappling in it, could the pandemic actually encourage more countries to cooperate with each other? For example, you have countries like Morocco and especially Jordan, which have dynamic pharmaceutical industries. And Jordan in particular, the pharmaceutical sector is female intensive. So, could there be better trade, more intensive trade with other MENA countries across the region, in this respect? So let me just add by, people have made this point already that, COVID-19 was a real shock to all these systems, the global system, national economies, healthcare systems, of course, and individual capacities. And, women were actually at the center of these intersecting inequalities. But of course, we know that their experiences differed, within countries and across countries. And in MENA, for example, women's experiences with the pandemic varied by national origin, where they were from, if they were migrants, social class, of course, occupation, location, but also state capacity. And some states, managed to do better and some states worse, given their pre-existing experience with shocks like sanctions, et cetera. I mean, Iran did extremely badly with the pandemic, and actually lost a lot of healthcare workers to the pandemic because they were not able to import and export so easily because of the American sanctions. So I've argued that this is an opportunity actually for governments to really rethink a lot of their own policies, especially with respect to female labor, and especially with respect to this trade-off between spending on the military versus spending in the social sectors and spending investments on women. And I'm hoping that there will be more investments in training women, especially those women who are not part of the labor force, training them for good jobs, by the way, not the rotten jobs that, in England now, all these healthcare workers are striking against, but good jobs in the healthcare systems across the board. So let me just end over there, and thank you, Rita, again for putting this together and for helping us all contribute to what is really an outstanding book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Val. I hope we continue the discussion on also zooming in later on the gap in research, health research, particularly pertaining to women and gender. This definitely came up in the chapter that Rita and I co-authored on masculinity. There was basically very little or no sex disaggregated data on health behaviors, etc., and outcomes. So Maro, I'm going to turn to you. Your chapter is part of the fourth pillar of the book that focuses on response. And it's actually a success story. So I'm very happy that you are here with us from California to walk us through how the Tunisian feminist movement actually came together. Despite their ideological differences, the secularists and the Islamist feminists came together to specifically address gender-based violence. And of course, as Rita mentioned earlier, there was the shadow pandemic of the COVID-19 pandemic was the GBV challenge. So how did these two groups come together to address this common problem in their society?
Thank you. So first, I want to say thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the giants in the field, like Hela, Rita, and the giants in the field, especially on Tunisia, Val and Maya, for giving me an opportunity to build on their work. So I couldn't have done this work on the new generation had I not been tracking what the old generation was doing, which Val and Maya have documented extensively. So first, the key to success there was that feminists were already mobilizing pre-pandemic, starting in the 90s, which Val and Maya have written about. So they already had the building blocks for organizing around gender-based violence. Then after the Arab Spring, Islamist and secularist organizations were also mobilizing around this. They worked together through donor-sponsored projects and separately, and also with politicians on this very progressive gender-based violence law that was passed in 2017. So there was already a culture of coalition building around this issue. So pre-pandemic feminist mobilization is key to the success we saw in Tunisia. During the pandemic, they continued to work on this issue separately, but also engaging parliament and other state officials, because at this point, they already had bipartisan support. It wasn't a contentious issue. They had already gotten the Islamists on board that this was critical for their constituents. Gender-based violence was critical. And my co-author, who couldn't be here today, Sarah Yerkes, writes extensively about coalition culture at the political level too. So together, we realized that this, because of pre-pandemic feminist mobilization and because the issue was not contentious before the pandemic as well, that's why we saw success. Feminists did not sit down and say, okay, we'll let the state take care of this, because the state was busy responding to everything else. So they worked with international organizations like the UN to pressure the state to do more. The UN helped establish a new shelter and a 24-hour hotline. And feminists themselves were collecting the data on the ground. It's not the UN, it's not international organizations, it's not even the state. They were collecting the data of women unable to access birth control at the hospitals after experiencing violence at home, because the hospitals shifted completely to treating COVID. They were taking in the victims themselves into their shelters. And they were holding Zoom trainings and educational seminars on what women could do to protect themselves during this very vulnerable period. So that's how we saw this success story. It's decades and decades of feminist mobilization, and it's finally figuring out that the Islamists and the secularists have something in common, and not just fight over the role of religion when it comes to women's rights or the state. And that's very important across the region to increase bipartisan support, to find the common issues that women face across the spectrum in all these societies. It's low employment, it's gender-based violence, it's low political participation. All women can benefit from that, regardless of politics and ideology. And that's how we had that.
Thank you. And just for the audience to know, to get a sense of the figures, there was an upsurge, an uptick in domestic violence, but what were the numbers like in Tunisia?
I think we wrote this chapter a long time ago, but I think we saw a 4 to 5-fold increase in reporting of gender-based violence cases in Tunisia. And that in itself is very important, because we got data on the reporting. We don't get data everywhere, so that I applaud the feminists for doing. They collected the data and the information on the ground. They were taking the calls from the call centers and documenting the uptick in this. But I want to say that the uptick was a global phenomenon. It's not just the Middle East. France had an uptick that was similar. The US had an uptick. So women are vulnerable everywhere, not just outside the West.
Yeah, thank you for putting that in context. So that's very important. And it goes back to what Lena mentioned earlier about, well, let's see what women are doing on the ground anyway. And in this particular case, because this coalition had come together before, then they were already mobilized, and they just had to come together and address and pressure the government. So that's another success story as to how to work with the government in a positive way, or a positive response from the government as well. And Munira, we are saving the best for last, because you reviewed the book, and we wanted to, given also your expertise in this topic, how do you see all of these contributions in this book also contributing to feminist work in the MENA region? And how can this book, with its various chapters, diverse topics, and as Rita mentioned earlier, the policy recommendations that are embedded in most of these essays, also serve as a tool for policymakers, not only in the region, but also in the donor community?
Thank you, Maricel. And thank you everyone for being at this panel. And I am delighted to be part of the discussion on this very important book. And thank you, Rita, for putting it together and the contributors for your amazing chapters. I think that in answering the question, I'll suggest that the book contributes to feminist works on the region in two related ways. First, by focusing on COVID's gendered effects. The book shows vividly how women pay a higher price during a crisis such as a pandemic. It highlights their vulnerabilities, for example, in facing new demands for care or new stresses at home, such as domestic violence. And what I find very interesting about that side of the book is how the chapters succeed in showing that increased vulnerabilities apply across the board. They apply across social classes, even though the suffering, even though the vulnerability may take a different form, they exist for women of all social classes. The underprivileged in rural areas are burdened by having to provide more care, new forms of care. But it is also interesting to me that among academics during the pandemic, men wrote more books, more articles, because they had more free time, so-called, which is not free time, but they could devote themselves to thinking and write books and articles. And the women say how they found it really hard to go on with their research, mostly because they had to arrange life at home in different ways, or they had to provide more care. And I think it's wonderful to have those articles that can be juxtaposed to each other and show how the vulnerabilities apply to so many women in different social classes. The second way in which the book, I think, contributes to feminist works on the region is by richly documenting the other side of the coin, women's agency in responding to the pandemic. By now, we have heard over and over and over again about women's agency in the MENA region in the scholarly literature. It is no longer a new point for most scholars, most policymakers, even though it seems to be a point that still needs to be made for the public discourse and some of the media. So the book not only states that point, which should be repeated again and again, even though we all know it by now, but I think the richness of the book is to actually document how the agency is expressed. So in the chapters, we read how women took action in response to the pandemic, and that is powerful. We read about and hear the voices of women as caregivers, educators, healthcare professionals, family providers, and civil society leaders. And for a reader like myself, this was so good, so important, so refreshing, not only to hear, oh, women have agency, women are not subordinate, women are doing things. It was no longer hearing that. It was hearing how women are doing things. So it is the how, which I think is where we are now in the scholarship on the region, and it is the how in the book that makes a contribution to feminist works on the region. The second question that Marisa asked is how can the book serve as a tool for policymakers in the region and beyond? And I think in that regard, I want to very quickly refer to a point that Val made when she said that at the end of her comments today, that she hopes that several countries in the region will spend less on the military and more on programs to train women or educate women and so on. And I think we all wish that, but I think this is a general problem. It is not true only in the MENA region. Many countries in the world, and we live in one, spend a lot more on the military and continue to do that, and are committed to continuing to do that, and much less on social programs or training of women. So we can have hope, but we also have to be realistic and realize that we live in a world where such big change is very unlikely to happen right now. So we have to do what we can with where we are. Mm-hmm. So the points that emerge, I think, from the book for policymakers are three. One, I think the arguments presented about COVID in the book can be extended to other major crises. The vulnerability of the greater vulnerabilities of women and the kinds of responses that women can bring, all of this can apply to other major crises. Those points apply beyond the case of pandemics to other situations such as wars, climate disasters that are pending all over the planet, and famines that are likely to result from those climate disasters. We also see a lot of that in operation in wars. Think about all the images of women during the Ukraine war. So this book can travel, the points in the book can travel to other situations, some of which we are very likely to confront in the next few decades, such as climate disasters and their consequences. The second point is that in a major crisis, when providing aid to the affected population, this is an obvious point that comes out of the book, let's encourage policymakers to pay close attention to women's vulnerabilities and to the way the crisis is affecting women in particular. Rather than having blanket programs, we might want to focus on some programs that are for women, because reaching women may require different modes of action on the part of policymakers above and beyond what is done to reach men, or at least different, since in crises, women continue to be the ones who care for infants, young children, the elderly, the vulnerable, and the sick. These are life-sustaining tasks that become infinitely more challenging during a pandemic or a major crisis and require several considerations. So the creativity in policymaking may rest in part with how to help women perform those tasks that they face in major crises. Then the third point follows from that, and it is my last point, and that is in designing forms of aid and enlisting local agents to carry out aid programs, let's pay close attention to the potential of women's agency. And I think the book also highlights the importance for policymakers of looking at local conditions. Mm-hmm. places are not photocopies of each other. Issues at the local level emerge from specific conditions of regions and localities. And it is important to find a way to give a voice to the local women when some of these programs are designed. I have been called upon many times, for example, to sit at the table to talk about programs for Tunisia or North Africa or the Middle East. But I realize that I don't always know what's going on in local areas, and that even though I know Tunisia, I know some of North Africa, I can contribute the best I can. I am still not like the local women who know what they need, who know what's going on, much better than I can ever know it. So in fact, I think we have to ask what local women can contribute, feel they need, by trying to provide locally meaningful solutions. And in conversations with Rita, she said, in fact, we should even say, don't make a decision regarding social and political outcomes without women being present at the table. And I have two minor modifications for people who are designing policy and for us feminists thinking about the region. Yes, you cannot make a decision without bringing women at the table. However, which women, that matters. Local women or women who know the local areas, that matters. Some countries have issues of refugees, other countries don't. Some countries have issues of migrants, some countries don't. So the local women have to deal with those conditions. And then the other thing is that I think as feminists, we realize we cannot ask for everything. Since all institutions are gendered, all institutions are gendered everywhere. Ideally, we would want to make sure that no one in the policy world makes a decision about social, political outcomes without bringing women to the table. However, we probably cannot get that. So I think what the book suggests to me is that in particular, in relation to healthcare and sometimes questions of live or die, then for those issues, we want to make sure that women are at the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Munira. You brought on so many very important points that actually linked to some of the questions I had, so some of the follow-up questions. But I'm going to change the order of things a little bit because we're running out of time. I want to make sure that we have the audience, at least the in-person audience, ask some questions. So I'm going to turn to the audience for questions and then come back to the panel for one more round of questions to sum up. So any questions here, or I have also online, please. Brooke, right there at the front.
Right there. Yeah.
Oh, did you? No? Okay, sorry. I thought there was a.
Oh, you have
Hind, okay. Oh, there you go.
Hi, thank you for doing this. I have some questions about the roots of the domestic abuse. Is it religion that gives the men superiority above women? Is it the financial situation that increased the domestic violence during the pandemic? Or there is no framework that protect women's rights? And another question, during the pandemic here in the United States, there were reports that the domestic violence has raised. So if you compare between one of the leading countries like the United States in protecting human rights and the MENA region. How big is the gap? And is there something that you can raise or point about the problem here in the United States too? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. But Rita, do you want to take this, or Lena?
I want to let.
Yeah, Lena.
Sure, I'm happy to take this. I've worked on ending violence against women, or trying to, all around the world, not just in the MENA region, but everywhere. And so, does it increase? Yes, it increases everywhere. You're right, it increased in the States too. The example of the text messaging, women trapped at home with their abusers, new cases of abuse that were emerging as a result. But to the point of why, I think this is the $6 million question. Why? Because they can, because patriarchy, because of a history of an abuse of power, because the soft targets, because this is what happens when there is any kind of insecurity, when lives are threatened, when livelihoods are challenged, when there is any deterioration in community, country, society, etc., in times of conflict, in post-conflict. I mean, it is, if I had an answer to that question, then I would have a solution. It would just be a magic pill that we would all take. It is infuriating, but it happens everywhere all the time. So, there's no country that's safe and no country that's immune. But the challenge is, when things are worse, when situations deteriorate, whether it's economic or political or health in terms of the pandemic or conflict or whatever, those numbers that are already quite high go much higher. What is the gap? I think it's difficult to say, because whatever we do know are just the reported cases. To everybody's point that we don't talk about these things enough, we don't report them enough. When we do report them, what is the incentive to report when there's no support and services, when there is shame and blame and stigma? For women to report cases of intimate partner violence, for instance, it takes a lot of courage. It takes access to a place that is safe and confidential. Medical care, psychosocial support, counseling, security sector, justice, all of these things. There are so many places where there are potential disconnects and opportunities to let women down, and we do. The system fails women over and over with all of these different places that should work together to prevent these things from happening. But that's the response side. Yeah. There's the whole other side of prevention. Yeah. Well, please, how are we still inflicting this kind of abuse on each other? And it's not just intimate partner violence, like in the region, for example, everywhere in the world, actually. Increase in girl-child marriage as a result. Economic insecurity, let's offload a daughter, that's an extra mouth to feed, girls getting married younger and younger, out of school. All of these things for me are a form of violence. It's a restriction on your life and freedom and your bodily autonomy and integrity. I don't even want to talk about bodily autonomy here in the US. Let me keep it polite. But just to say, this is a huge challenge everywhere. And, it's society and the way we are built, and how we're going to end it. We need a total rewiring. We need to just stop believing that that is okay or acceptable or any kind of adequate response in a time of crisis. It starts from very young ages, from children learning about consent and safe touching, and none of this, boys will be boys kind of crap that we hear all the time. I mean, I could go on for hours. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Lena. We have another question from Hind.
Thank you so much for this enlightening talk. My question might be like a little bit on the broad side, but I just wonder if you think that COVID has been an impetus for improving women's entrepreneurship in the MENA region, meaning that had governments taken COVID context into consideration to see how they can improve women's involvement in the labor market, mitigate those challenges, having them work from home and establish their own businesses, women-led businesses, etc. And then my second question is, to what extent do you think the policies that have been adopted by these governments in order to improve women's well-being in the MENA societies encompass even low-paid workers? So, for example, I'm thinking about the Gulf context, where there are low-wage workers, including maids or housekeepers working in the household. Their situation has also worsened because of COVID. But to what extent do you think those policies have or have not even, I'm not sure, included those women? Because we can't just say we have to look into national women and not look into like low-paid workers, including women, housekeepers. So, and what are the challenges in this current moment?
Thank you, Rita.
I can take that.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Absolutely. So the first question about entrepreneurship, it is really countries that had something in place to start with. And I don't want to only credit the government. I want to use the example of Jordan, where there was already a women's empowerment group, economic empowerment group, that as soon as COVID hit, and they were into textile, producing rope, etc., things with and exporting internationally. As soon as COVID hit, there was a shift. They said, let's instead make masks. Mm-hmm. And so immediately they started that production that was run by women, that business, it was supported by a women organization. So there was that being attuned to what's going on. Lots of, we saw many women went online, and being online is a platform that was open, I would say about 20, 30 years ago. So women had that access initially. In the Gulf specifically, I want to say that nationals benefited a lot from the perks that the governments provided. And we saw in a survey that in the chapter, one of the chapters asked their well-being, and women were feeling they're okay, they're doing well. Again, national. So this is every situation is modified. Generally speaking, the have-nots were extremely affected, right? Regardless. Even in refugee camps, we saw that women could no longer earn an income, so this is where they started bartering. They started making food and selling it to each other, clothing, etc. So there were resourcefulness that came to place in the economic area, where women were not really, they didn't have a say going into the pandemic, but their reaction to the economic hardship was very creative and innovative.
Thank you. And Val, would you answer the second question on GCC and migrant workers and policies and how the pandemic affected? Okay, we're not hearing from Val. We'll get.
There we go. Just one thing on entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship is usually touted as a kind of panacea for women, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. I mean, the assumption is always that it's a conservative region, and women prefer to work at home with their children, et cetera, not have interaction with men and so on. And these assumptions, I think, are not tested or verified. But also, it's also true that just in general, the data suggests that entrepreneurship is actually very limited in the region. And the kind of entrepreneurship that possibly, Rita, I don't want to speak for you, Rita, but the kind of entrepreneurship that is most prevalent is really low level. And it's a variant of precarious self-employment. So, I think that entrepreneurship is not a panacea unless, of course, women have access to the credits that they deserve, which, is also difficult in many countries, loans, et cetera. And by the way, what is also needed is equal inheritance. And I've written about this as well, because a lot of, women-owned businesses start with their own family wealth, their own, capital. And if women are not getting the same as the brothers in their families, or, the widows are not getting the same as the male kin of their husbands, et cetera, this is a problem. As for migrant domestic workers, I did mention that they are domestic workers almost everywhere are not part of labor law. So traditionally, they domestic workers and agricultural workers have not been covered by labor legislation, although in almost every country in the world, except for the former communist countries where you didn't have domestic workers anyway, but you did have agricultural workers. But there is an international law now that the ILO pushed for domestic workers. And guess what? Not a single Persian Gulf Arab sheikhdom has signed it. They have not signed the Convention on Domestic Workers. They have not signed the convention, the UN Convention on the rights of migrant workers and their families. So what we need is legislation. We need these governments to sign on to existing conventions, to existing international conventions on worker rights, and to expand the remit of labor legislation and worker rights to different categories of workers, including those numerous migrant workers that are seen in the Gulf sheikdoms and also, frankly, in Lebanon and Jordan, the migrant domestic workers. We also need, by the way, more laws, going back to the discussion of violence against women. It's only been in the past, 3, 4, 5 years that MENA countries have actually been passing legislation on domestic violence. It's very, very recent. There's an excellent book by Laurel Weldon and Malatoon on, the proliferation, the global diffusion of laws on violence against women. And there are different reasons for that, the strength of, feminist movements, and also, the demonstration effect, of neighbors and so on. But we need to see more of that in the region, and we need to see, frankly, harsher penalties for the perpetrators of violence. But that also means correcting family law and correcting aspects of the penal code that also differentiates men and women, Muslim and non-Muslim, and so on. So these kinds of discriminations in the existing legal frameworks have to be reformed. And we just need more laws for domestic workers, for migrant workers, for violence against women, and better policies for women-owned businesses.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Val. Of course, passing the laws is important, but it's also a matter of implementation. And I'm going to go to tomorrow here to talk about that aspect of it in Tunisia, I guess.
You read my mind.
I did.
Okay. So we had this very progressive law in Tunisia that had bipartisan political support, passed in 2017, where women did not have to marry their rapists and abusers anymore, where the police stations had to embed a female officer at each location, which they have not done, and where if a woman filed a complaint, she could not get it dismissed. The state had the responsibility to follow through and prosecute. The problem in Tunisia is lack of implementation. That's what I heard in 2018 and 2019 and after, especially during the pandemic. The state lacks the will, the resources, and the capacity to implement these things. So when we look at how donors could support, and as you were saying, Lena, judicial and security sector reforms, that's one way that they can build that in, that they keep a gendered perspective and have a gendered approach, which means on the donor side, they need to have gender experts involved in creating these programs and aid packages. And that's how we could start to think about enabling the state and building its capacity to implement these laws. And as Munira and I have written, and Val, inheritance law must be reformed, and that's the biggest point of contention in the women's movement in Tunisia. And
Between
that's actually
the Islamists and the secularists?
Exactly, because it's rooted in religion and tradition. So that we can't have any progress without that, without empowering women financially.
That was a very important finding in 2 reports that we published. The first one, which is available outside, on women in leadership in the public sector. A very interesting finding was that unequal inheritance actually impacted women's leadership in the public sector. And the most recent report that we launched last month on women and entrepreneurship in the MENA region also, of course, goes back to that because of basically the lack of asset ownership, As Val mentioned, very, very low levels of entrepreneurship due to the fact that women don't have access to finance, don't have access to capital. And if you don't have assets, you don't have collateral, the banks will reject you, even though legally they can't, but they do. So it's all connected to basically what we're discussing today. If I don't, and we have one more question from the audience, and then I'll turn to final thoughts.
My name is Hanan Zalwani Idrisi. Thank you for convening this panel, and thank you, Rita, and all the contributors for documenting this knowledge and sharing it with us. My question is about if the book has looked at the extent to which women has access to the internet and digital equipment also has impacted them during this period. Thank you.
Thank you. Rita, you want to take this?
Yeah, in fact, the internet comes in various ways. We know immediately that education shifted online. And that was an issue in terms of access to not only reliable internet in the homes, even rural homes, computers for every child in the house, and maybe a quiet room to actually conduct classes. So that really affected education a lot and put more burden on women. But your question is, did women make use of the internet? What we know, WhatsApp became the new hotline for women, because women who were part of support group could chat without their husbands actually seeing that they're calling someone, especially when most of the shelters were closed. So WhatsApp was kind of a way of asking for help, and we see many women's groups did report an increase in messaging using that. The only thing that I can think of is, using online for work. That didn't make a difference whether or I didn't see that captured in any of the chapters per se. In fact, women used the online accessibility, the information to find resources, to find help, mostly when it comes to actually safety at home and ways to kind of improve their productivity. We know that researchers, for instance, it didn't make a difference. There's a chapter on research and scholarship. It didn't make a difference to have the online accessibility because that was previously. There's a chapter on from LAU on women working from home. They were able to use the connectivity to work from home. These are professional women. So in general, if I were to say, it was a resource that accelerated when it was available, and the different formats of social media and online accessibility provided women access to, help, to connection. Many courts ended up being virtual for many years after, being shut down for a while. So the world did become virtual, and women did use those mediums.
Thank you, Rita. So we have about a minute and a half left, but I'm going to ask each one of you, and we can take a few extra minutes, just under a minute, to perhaps sum up the one thing you will tell an international development agency or a donor agency when designing a policy response in MENA concerning women's rights and not necessarily healthcare, but just in general. One learning from this book that could shape how we're thinking about this. I'll go to Lena first because you just...
Yes, yes,
Sure.
please.
Well, I would say all because you don't see women doesn't mean they're not there.
Mm-hmm.
Being the secret weapon doesn't mean that it's shrouded in secrecy. Women are present and powerful and need to be amplified everywhere. And if they are not there, then whatever intervention they're aiming for is destined for failure.
Thank you.
And I would say continue to invest in women and civil society, even during times that are less hopeful, like after the Arab Spring now. Donors are not as interested in the region. They think it's a failed experiment. But if you ignore women now and respond again during another crisis or transition like the Arab Spring, you lose your contacts, you lose trust in the networks. You can't just flock to the region when there's a crisis or when it's sexy. You have to stay committed.
Thank you. Munira?
I think something that I'm taking away from the conversation today, not only from the book, is of course how extremely important it is to do what Maho is talking about and pay attention to women in the region and pay attention to the region, even when it is not at the forefront of international news, which it doesn't seem to be right now. But I think something that's striking too is that, we talk about what states do to address the needs of women, but there is also such a thing as state capacities. And I think Tunisia is a prime example of that. And I not today, but on another day, I want to discuss with Maho really what we mean by success, because Tunisia is presented as the success story, but it is not the case that it has had decades of feminist organizing. It has not. It has had state feminism until fairly recently in history. And that's a very different kind of story. And then feminists emerged recently. But I think that what's going on now is not just that the state is not paying enough attention to women. Maybe it is not, but the state is also in a condition in which it has very limited capacities.
Yeah.
So states exist beyond what they do for women, about women. They exist as institutions that shape the country as a whole. And then if the state loses capacities, as is the case in Tunisia right now, everybody is affected. Women are affected, men are affected, every social class is affected. So I think that what I've been trying to say about gender in the region for a very long time now, I'm going to say today again, and that is that we cannot understand gender issues in the region separate from what is happening with the general context of politics and social organization.
Absolutely.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Munira. Val?
Yeah, thanks. With respect to donors, they haven't always served the region very well. Actually, Munira, speaking of Tunisia, the donors have not helped Tunisia very much. Donor countries in particular in our region spend so much on the military. USAID, its aid to Jordan, between 35 and almost 50% of it is military aid. Okay, that kind of assistance we don't need. Tunisia needed, in fact, good foreign direct investment, et cetera, and that was not coming. And so it kept getting loans from the IMF, and it was up to here in debt. And then that also generated that, that political crisis that Qais Said actually made worse. But finally, I would just say that I have a message actually to governments and not so much to donors, apart from don't sell military stuff to the region, okay? But for the governments, invest more in the women, in their reproductive labor, in policies that will guarantee their ability to balance home life and work, their ability to attain decent work, what the ILO calls decent work, and also to make sure that all women have access to good reproductive health. And that's why you have to train more women for the healthcare sector across the board. Thanks.
Thank you, Val. And the last word goes to you, Rita.
Well, and to you, Marissa.
I will do that. But go ahead.
Two things. I think one, we have to move from the hot potato response to intervention in the world. And I feel that a lot of the programs that we have are from one crisis to the other. Instead, I would recommend that we move into prevention, into stabilization. The second point I want to say, and I want to quote my former colleague at USAID, Dr. Clifton Cannon, who said to me, "It's okay to be a token. We need tokens to run machines." And and that is, it's okay to have women present in every panel, every setting as tokens. I will take that. I want a woman quota for every decision, policy decision, political decision, military decision, and I will accept the tokenization of women to run the machine more effectively.
Yeah, I like that, especially for
Yeah,
some
that's
countries
nice.
who are against quota systems. Quotas work, absolutely. Well, I guess my few last words would go back to a point that Munira made in her review earlier, which I also heard from so many people in the region in the last few weeks. We were just in the Middle East, particularly from young people. Going back to Lena's hopeful message, basically with youth, right, or at least where the hope is, and that is localization. Localization of solutions, localization of understanding the local networks and communities, what they're doing, and supporting that, listening to them, and where needed, I guess pulling strings with the government, because the pressure also is important vis-a-vis the central authorities. And if the local actors cannot do it themselves, they will require support from, global donors, others in the field, UN, etc. So that's definitely something that I heard from so many different people, and the fact that this book brings so many different local and regional voices, I think amplifies this message further. So thank you all for being here, for sharing your thoughts, and Rita for bringing everybody together to write and discuss COVID and gender in the MENA region. And we look forward to hosting more discussions on the topic, and we will see you later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Val.
Thank you so much.